In order to grasp the ways in which alchemical symbolism came to be perceived in the late 20th century up till today, we must take a look at the reception of alchemy in the 19th through into the 20th century. We have already seen in the first of these presentations that alchemical publications dropped almost to zero at the beginning of the 19th century. Around the turn of the 18th into the 19th century, we find a number of enthusiasts and researchers trying to record and preserve alchemical texts. Among these were Sigismund Backstrom, Ebenezer Sibley, and Francis Barrett. Perhaps they had some sense that interest in alchemy was waning. Many of their manuscript transcriptions have survived. Little original material appeared in the opening decades of the 19th century. Then in 1832, a small book was published with the title Hermes Dévoilé, Hermes Revealed. This purported to be by a French adept called Ciliani. It is an account of his search for the Philosopher's Stone and includes a section in the form of a conventional alchemical allegory. In 1829, François Cambriel created a series of 19 lessons on the philosophy and practice of alchemy. In 1843, these were published in Paris. This was a strange work in which the author revealed himself as not possessing the secrets of alchemy, but if he were given sufficient funding, he would be able to discover these secrets. There were a handful of other such publications, but the momentum of writing on alchemy had entirely collapsed. This hiatus in interest in alchemy was to change with the appearance of the books published under the name Eliphas Levi. First appeared in 1854 the Dogme de la Haute Magie, followed in 1856 by the companion volume Rituel de la Haute Magie. Its famous opening lines, though not written until 1861, after the initial success of the first edition, presents the single essential theme of occultism as a secret esoteric tradition that he saw as underlying many aspects of human culture. Behind the veil of all the hieratic and mystical allegories of ancient doctrines, behind the darkness and strange ordeals of all initiations, under the seal of all sacred writings, in the ruins of Nineveh or Thebes, on the crumbling stones of old temples, and on the blackened visage of the Assyrian or Egyptian Sphinx, in the monstrous or marvellous paintings which interpret to the faithful of India the inspired pages of the Vedas, in the cryptic emblems of our old books on alchemy, in the ceremonies practiced at reception by all secret societies, there are found indications of a doctrine which is everywhere the same and everywhere carefully concealed. Levi's books were illustrated with a number of engravings, somewhat inspired by alchemical symbolism, some of which he was undoubtedly aware. We've already seen in the first presentation that his notorious Baphomet image was partly based on an engraving in the works of the alchemical philosopher Heinrich Kunrat. Levi's views on an occult secret doctrine could merely have been the isolated opinions of an eccentric individual. However, they resonated with a retreat from rationalism that was occurring within the French intelligentsia at that time. So Levi's perspective rapidly gained traction and began to influence many writers. Thus Levi and his followers sought to recontextualize alchemy, among other aspects of early culture, within the idea of there being part of a hidden occult tradition, which was not accessible in the historical record. There being no historical traces of such a secret tradition, instead this perspective rested entirely within a belief system. Thus we should see this idea of an esoteric secret doctrine as a meta-narrative, a fictional account of history that nevertheless was seductive and provided simplistic answers to complex and often difficult areas of cultural history. Such meta-narratives, however, corrode people's ability to see a subject such as alchemy within its proper historical context. It was not only the French-speaking world that was embracing this emerging syncretic esoteric philosophy, but in Britain and the USA, the Theosophical Society was emerging. Its initial aims, expressed in 1875, were the study and elucidation of occultism, paralleling the views of Levi. Later, the Theosophical Society broadened its perspective, seeing all religions as having some common basis. It blinded itself to the obvious irreconcilable differences found in the multiplicity of belief systems it sought to unify. And so various movements budded off from it well into the early 20th century, an obvious example being Rudolf Steiner's Christian European Anthroposophy. Many such groups emerged, centered on individuals affecting clairvoyance, a kind of spiritual perception that could not be challenged. From within the Theosophical Society, Annie Besant and Leadbeater turned their clairvoyant gaze on the structure of matter and devised a book entitled Occult Chemistry, issued in 1908. This drew on the then emerging idea of the periodic table of the elements. They also saw the structure of atoms as a complex vortex of subtle forces. This image they clairvoyantly saw actually came from a book, The Principles of Light and Colour, by the American Edwin Babbitt, published some 30 years earlier in 1878. Babbitt's conception was entirely derived from his abstract theoretical ideas on the forces within atoms, and had no esoteric input, but may have drawn on the physicist Lord Kelvin's 1867 paper on atoms as vortices of forces. Leadbeater so elaborated his picturing of atoms that the ideas all but collapsed under their own weight and complexity. As these theories had no predictive power, they made little impact outside of the believers. We should consider their occult chemistry as signifying one of the ways in which alchemy became transformed through the interaction with modernity, the rise of pseudoscience. We still find this pseudoscience today with the idea of ormes, supposedly orbitally rearranged monoatomic elements, and the white powdered gold invented in the late 1970s by the American farmer David Hudson. This self-deception was to some extent based on alchemical ideas, and later sparked off a not insignificant business supplying substances which are believed to provide healing, which then metamorphosed into superconductivity, anti-gravity, and free energy devices. Hudson and others sought endorsement for their claims by recontextualizing alchemy. many similar pseudoscientific ideas have emerged, derived from or using alchemy as a philosophical underpinning. Another shoot emerging from the Theosophical Society was the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, established in 1888 as a secretive, invitation-only group, partly modelled on Freemasonry, but with an hermetic charge. Much of its inner teachings were a contextualizing of alchemical ideas within an overarching magical structure. Part of the inner teaching involved the construction of magical diagrams, drawing somewhat from alchemical emblems. This constituted a magical meta-narrative that is still very persuasive. Historical alchemists were rarely involved in magical practices, though the term natural magic was sometimes used, as in the writings of Della Porta. But here it essentially means natural philosophy rather than ritual ceremonial magic, goetic theurgy, or the summoning of spirits and similar sorcery. There were a few exceptions who involved both in alchemy and the ritual type of magic, the best known being Edward Kelly during the Elizabethan period. However, during the last half century or so, many people have, through this meta-narrative, come to view alchemists as magicians. A whole slew of books on alchemy, using these sorts of esoteric ideas, were issued in the late 20th century, and the momentum still continues today. These are usually totally derivative works, drawing on similar such writings, and usually it becomes obvious that the author has not thought it necessary or important to do any actual primary research. These authors and the various experts touring the lecture and weekend seminar circuits came to construct a new 20th century belief system under the umbrella of alchemy. This had almost nothing to do with historical alchemy, as these writers and speakers had little interest in studying the original writings, and instead put their energies into devising a persuasive rhetoric. This seemed to meet a need in the interested public for a simple, easy to understand philosophy and lifestyle that they saw as being endorsed by the alchemists of half a millennium earlier. This constructed alchemy has now become so ingrained that it has a life of its own, and will probably continue to develop for many more decades. Its underlying body of preconceptions and invented history seems sufficiently coherent that it is impervious to the truths of document-based historical research. Such meta-narratives are not confined to the modern period. A number of attempts to recontextualize alchemical ideas even occurred back in the 16th and 17th centuries. The best known of these was that of the Rosicrucians. From about 1612, there were circulated a number of open letters and some manifestos promoting the idea that there existed a group of Rosicrucian adepts who held the secrets of alchemy, and even had a secret underground vault as a base. This was such a powerful idea that it influenced many alchemical writers through till the end of the 18th century, even being revived in the late 19th century and again reconstructed in the 1970s as a current in Palatinate history by the scholar Francis Yates. Another way of looking at alchemy arose in the mid-19th century through Mary Ann Atwood's suggestive inquiry into the Hermetic mystery. She wished to recontextualize alchemy as being involved somehow with the personal development of the human being. Atwood was influenced by the then current English obsession with the ideas of Mesmer, who had popularized a belief in a non-corporeal fluid a sort of ether that permeated all space and even entered people's bodies, often described as animal magnetism, which can now be seen as a method of hypnotism. Atwood wished us to see that this undetectable fluid was the prima materia of the alchemists, and the alchemist's own body was the vessel and laboratory in which alchemical transmutation would occur. In the closing sections of her book, she states, "Alchemy is a universal art of vital chemistry, which, by fermenting the human spirit, purifies and finally dissolving it, opens the elementary germ into a new life and consciousness." Her book was withdrawn, and her ideas held back from substantially influencing the way people saw alchemy until a reprint in 1918 brought this back into the public sphere. Even today, her book still holds a considerable influence upon the development of the view of alchemy as a method for inner or spiritual development. This inner development meta-narrative was to merge with and become amplified by the relocation of Eastern meditation practices into the West and the reconstruction of Western shamanism. A number of the major players in the Golden Dawn and its later offshoots were involved in the translation and publication of classic Latin alchemical texts, such as the Hermetic Museum, 1893, the Triumphal Chariot of Antimony of Basil Valentine, also 1893, Hermetic and Alchemical Writings of Paracelsus, 1894, the Petrus Bonus New Pearl of Great Price, the same year, and the Turba Philosophorum of 1896, and a number of other key works of alchemy. Thus, for the first time, alchemical texts in English fell into the hands of general readers outside of libraries. This openness to exploring alchemical texts resulted in the founding of the short-lived Alchemical Society in London in November 1912, which was set up to study the works and theories of the alchemists in all their aspects, philosophical, historical and scientific, and of all matters relating thereto. A number of its members were such as A.E. Waite, who was immersed in the stream of the Golden Dawn, and simultaneously responsible for translating many of the key alchemical texts. But it primarily attracted more scholarly people, such as the great collector John Ferguson and Stanley Redgrove, and the papers published in its journal were primarily of a historical and scholarly nature. Later, in 1935, the Society for the History of Alchemy and Chemistry was formed in London and began issuing its journal Ambix, which continues to this day. This brought the study of alchemy back into the realm of exact scholarship. From the late 1960s, the study of alchemy within the context of the history of ideas and the history of science gained ground, and a number of major scholars were able to embrace the subject, which led to a mass of PhD theses appearing from the 1970s onwards. This scholarship sought to find the correct context for alchemical texts, imagery, and ideas. The emergence and consolidation of a scholarly approach to alchemy was put in danger of becoming undermined by the seductive Jungian meta-narrative, which emerged with the publication of Jung's book, Psychology and Alchemy, which, though issued in German in 1944, did not appear in English till 1953. This was followed by his more mass-market book, Man and His Symbols, in 1964. Psychology and Alchemy is probably the most influential book about alchemy in the 20th century. It contains some 270 illustrations, and his remarks and commentaries seemed, at first glance, very convincing and based on a scholarly perspective. Jung's scholarship, on deeper consideration, however, appeared to be built on a body of preconceptions that ultimately require the reader to believe in. Jung's belief system is clearly the most persuasive of meta-narratives applied to alchemy. In a sense, Jung wrapped up the various meta-narratives into his own psychological theory. For example, Levi's devising of an esoteric secret doctrine underlying human culture was translated into Jung's concept of a transcultural collective unconscious. We no longer had to follow Levi and envisage secret groves, hidden ritual centres, mysterious shrouded adepts. Instead, for Jungians, all of this lay unconsciously inside of every human being. One of Jung's closest collaborators, Marie-Louise von Franz, said, "It is naturally very tempting to identify the hypothesis of the collective unconscious, historically and regressively, with the ancient idea of an all-extensive world soul." In this Jungian world, no longer did we find ourselves within a historical current, rooted to our own culture, but we all contained within ourselves archetypes that transcended our culture and time. This meant that Jungians could even seriously consider that Australian Aboriginal myths and legends might throw some light on 17th century European alchemy, or that we should turn to the dreams of someone of today to understand an old alchemy text. As an example, let us consider the 2003 publication of the Jung Institute of Los Angeles. The book starts off with a survey of the life of the 10th century Ibn Umayl and continues by describing a particular manuscript which contains a very interesting coloured allegorical painting. But suddenly, on page 29, the author of this book, Theodor Abd, feels it necessary to recount a dream of some unknown modern man, indicating that it will help us understand the symbolism of Ibn Umayl. We seem now in the realm of a total collapse of context and transported into an entirely ahistorical world. The Jungian meta-narrative proves seductive to the modern mind, yet corrosive of linear rational thought. To step into this meta-narrative requires abandoning any sense of historical development, and an acceptance that two cultures, totally disjoint historically and geographically, can have influenced one another. To Jungians, this is an acceptable price to pay for their belief-driven psychological model. From the late 1960s, a stream of books on various esoteric themes emerged, eventually becoming a torrent. These drew on magic, astrology, Celtic and Grail myths, a fabricated envisaging of shamanism, tarot, and of course alchemy. These writers, for the most part, unquestioningly accepted the Jungian meta-narrative, which often served as a support for ill-conceived research, allowing writers to draw links between ideas or traditions where there was no evidence that any existed. This fed the proliferation of actual magical cultic groups and weekend retreats where people were sometimes led to an encounter with what they thought to be underlying spiritual forces or archetypes. These books were often profusely illustrated with images taken from a multiplicity of historical sources, including alchemy, but usually entirely excised from the original context, probably often chosen by picture editors for aesthetic reasons within the book design rather than for any coherent reason. Alchemical illustrations were thus often used purely as decorative elements. This muddling up of images led to their often being divorced from their context. Items that were in no way alchemical were labelled as such. In 1996, the Alexander Rube book, Alchemy und Mystik, was published, quickly to be issued in English as Alchemy and Mysticism. This profusely illustrated 700-plus page book was a vehicle for imagery and included little explanatory text. It purported to give the reader an overview of alchemy and mysticism, providing an hermetic museum, but it was a melange of imagery from all sorts of sources. Even the cover of some hardback editions used an image which has nothing to do with either mysticism or alchemy, but instead was taken from the late 15th century untitled manuscript, now called the Este de Sfera, which has many beautiful images of the planets and their influence on the outer world, clearly an astrological piece. Another edition repeats the confusion, this time using an image from the 17th century celestial cartographer Andreas Cellarius, here an astronomical work. Inside the book, in places, series of alchemical images that were part of the same work were printed hundreds of pages apart, and there was no historical sequence. A reader without specialist knowledge was just lost in a sea of engaging but decontextualized images. With the rise of internet image sharing sites such as Tumblr, Pinterest, and Flickr, individuals, some appearing to have no knowledge or understanding of the material at all, put up a massive imagery under the title of alchemy or related terms. Items from emblem books, illuminated manuscripts, even the paintings of old masters were now labelled as alchemical. Image search engines, such as that of Google, further consolidated this material and bundled it up, so one lost any sense of where the image came from. People then raided these image banks and chose images for use in their blogs or website pages, often believing them to be alchemical when they have no connection whatsoever to alchemy. They also feel free to attach their own commentary, as people today, labouring under the illusions of postmodernism, applied outside its contexts of political history and modern media, feel that anyone's opinion and understanding of an image, even if it is based upon a total misunderstanding or ignorance of the material, is, nevertheless, valid. The understanding of alchemical symbolism and its place in history seems entirely lost, except to the few people who have made a close study of the subject and have at least viewed many hundreds of books and manuscripts. Decontextualization is now almost complete, and it's a hard task now for someone to find the original context for a particular image, and, in any case, few people today consider this worthwhile. It is only when people become aware of the fictional, belief-driven nature of these many meta-narratives, and the ways in which they subtly filter their perception of these images, that they can come to a real encounter with what was originally intended by the creator of an alchemical emblem. All else is just mere storytelling. Sadly, few people are sufficiently engaged by this imagery to wish to truly grasp it. Instead, we see that especially during the 20th century, there has been constructed a modern idea of alchemy that has only selectively drawn on historical alchemy. Thus has been created a sort of simplistic, cartoon-like alchemy that the modern mind responds to, and which satisfies the need in the popular mind for a way of envisaging the subject. These 3 videos have been an attempt, however imperfect, to survey the ways in which alchemical symbolism appeared in the historical tradition, and the way in which our modern age has massaged and remade the subject. There seems no way back for most people into a true encounter with what the alchemists were actually saying in their texts and imagery, as this requires much hard work and research, and there are so many easy-to-read books available which claim to reveal what alchemy is about. I will, over the next few months, revisit and critique in more detail some of these meta-narratives in further audiovisuals for YouTube.